economic crisis. And because of that, the Spanish chapter of Students for Liberty has started a fundraiser together with the Spanish Red Cross and other organizations in order to help those in need. The link is in the YouTube description, and very quickly I will also post the link into the Zoom chat, so you can donate money via credit card. You can donate money via PayPal. It's very easy. I think in these difficult times, we all should be bleeding heart libertarians, if you will. So today's guest is a longtime friend of Students for Liberty. He is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and the director of Cato University. He is the vice president for international programs at the Atlas Network and is responsible for establishing operating programs in 14 languages and managing programs for a worldwide network of think tanks. He is an established speaker on conferences, for example, conferences of Students for Liberty, like LibertyCons, all around the world. Dr. Palmer, because we're talking, of course, about Dr. Tom Palmer, has received his bachelor's in liberal arts from St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, his master's in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and his doctorate in politics from Oxford University. And Tom Palmer is also one of the reasons why I am holding this interview today, because 5 years ago, when I went to the first SFL event I ever went to, my good friend Alex brought some merchandise, and he brought this little yellow book. And I was already a libertarian. However, I thought, well, this organization isn't only for young people, isn't only libertarian. They are actually bringing out books. They are trying to educate people. And as you probably know, this little yellow book, By Liberty, which is a great introduction to libertarianism, was edited by Tom Palmer. So I'm very thankful for that. And I think if you are new to libertarianism and you are listening out there, it's a great start. So if you are on a conference of Students for Liberty and you can grab one, grab one. Tom, thank you for being here with us tonight. Before I come to our main topic and address the big elephant in our room, I want to ask a very basic question, because I assume that there might be some people who don't really know what libertarianism is, who don't know what classical liberalism is, and they're just simply not aware, and I think you are the right person to explain to them what that is. Why are you a libertarian, and why is almost every person at least a little bit libertarian?
Well, I think it starts with the fundamental principle of showing respect for people. And given that, I want to start by showing my respect and gratitude to you for arranging this. Students for Liberty is a very important organization. It's very dear to my heart. I am a donor every month, and then at the end of the year, I give my money to Students for Liberty. And it's very important to me. You give me inspiration and hope for the future. So I'm very personally grateful to you, and I respect you and all of your fellow members and Students for Liberty Deutschland, European Students for Liberty, all over the world for what you are doing for your liberty and for mine. Well, we start with the basic point. Most people in modern society, the vast majority, have already internalized the basic ideas of libertarianism or classical liberalism, if you will, which is not to go around hitting other people, not to steal what belongs to them, and of course, not to lie and deceive people in ways that are harmful to them. Those three fundamental principles are really foundational for a decent social order. And most people, of course, they have internalized them. If they want something, they don't just smash the window and take it. They go in and they offer something in exchange for it, money, which is a medium of exchange. If they want someone to do something, they don't kidnap them and put them in chains and beat them to make them wash the dishes or cook a meal or cut your hair or whatever it happens to be. We offer something that other people want, or we make a request to them. Would you please do that? And so the question that's always puzzled me is why so many people behave in that way. They've internalized the fundamental principles of a civil society. But then they think they're these magical creatures, politicians, Beamten, officials, and so on, who have some special power, a magical power, and that they can do things you and I could not do. That they can beat you, they can smash down your doors and tell you you cannot own a plant in your house because it's on a list that they forbid. They can beat you up if you don't worship God in the way that they prefer, you worship in some other way or not at all, and so on. And it became a kind of puzzle for me why people had internalized the principles, but somehow thought there was this special magical body. And I realized a long time ago, and one of the people who helped me to realize this was Frédéric Bastiat, my personal hero, the great French liberal, who wrote in such simple, plain language, they're just people, politicians, police officers, officials in government departments, they're just people. They're no better and no worse than you and me. They're not all bad and they're not all good. They're not completely stupid, but they're not all knowing and all wise. They're just as fallible as you and I are. And the principles of a civil society should apply to them as well, which means to be governed by the law that governs all of us. And that means fundamentally, don't hit other people, don't take things from them without their permission, and don't deliberately mislead and lie to people in such ways that they're harmful, breaking contracts or telling people to go down this road when they're going to drive off the bridge and die, and so on. Those are three fundamental principles that inform libertarianism. For me, libertarianism isn't some sacred ideology you read from the sacred books like Marxism. You have to go to the holy book of Marx and get all the answers. It's about a much more commonsensical view about how to live together peacefully.
All right, thank you for this answer. So I will come to the actual topic of this interview. I think everyone who has been on the internet or has been watching TV in the last days knows that the only topic that really exists is the Corona crisis and maybe some of the results of the Corona crisis. So there is a lot of uncertainty regarding the data, but we know that it is a problem. I think it's undeniable at this stage that it is a significant problem. We just don't know how significant. And I think many people from all spectrums, doesn't matter if it's libertarians or conservatives or nationalists or socialists, naturally they have developed something like the confirmation bias. Yes. So, and I fear that especially the left and the, let's say, modern national populist right, their confirmation bias is contra-libertarian. So naturally the left blames capitalism for the Corona crisis. The right doesn't directly blame libertarianism or capitalism. They use other words. They typically use words like globalism, globalization, free movement, etc., etc. But they see, yes, precisely. So, but is capitalism really responsible for the situation that we are in right now?
Well, let me start by highlighting the wisdom of what you said, that confirmation bias is all around us. As I read recently, someone said, wow, I just recently learned about confirmation bias, and now I see it everywhere. And so there is lots of confirmation bias, and we should be careful not to fall into that. This virus was not caused by socialism or nationalism and so on. It's a part of the natural world. So the question is, what are the better responses to it? We can ask, what did fuel it in some sense? And I think Chinese authoritarianism does deserve some of the blame. The authoritarian model suppressed information and punished doctors who were trying to warn people. So there's some sense in which authoritarianism has shown itself not to be a good answer to this problem. All of the authoritarians are insisting that authoritarian powers and dictatorship and unaccountable power are the answer. But I think now we have good reason to think that's not true. The argument that somehow we hear in the United States, oh my gosh, if only we had the medical system of state provision that they have in other countries, this won't be a problem. Like Italy, for example, or the National Health Service in Great Britain, where they're having very serious problems despite having the medical systems that Bernie Sanders, the socialist, says will save us. So I think these are just fantasies. And they're really examples of ideological overreach, trying to find anything to justify your prior beliefs. And I think that we should be careful not to fall into that as well. Now, I think there is a case that can be made that global trade and global travel means that pandemics travel more quickly. That's fairly obvious and more widely. On the other hand, those things also make us so much wealthier than we would be in their absence. So pandemics or widespread infectious diseases have not been a serious problem for about 100 years. They used to be quite regular events, plagues and the like. And we owe our greater wealth and our greater ability to deal with these things exactly to the increase in trade, the increase in markets, the increase in the division of labor, and yes, the increase in travel as a consequence. So I think that that's really a silly claim to make, because we would have expected to see, if global trade and capitalism was the cause of pandemics, that as it increased, we'd have more. But that didn't happen. We've had fewer plagues and problems of this sort. I think that there are lessons to be drawn, however, and this is a case in which classical liberals can have some special insights about the role of innovation and responsiveness and non-bureaucratic responses. So the United States is a fairly good example of a case study of bad public health policy, incompetent government that has not done its job correctly. I think the US government has been, on the federal level at least, remarkably incompetent at dealing with a public health emergency that I think is a legitimate core responsibility of government. Unlike in Germany and unlike in South Korea, the private sector was deliberately forbidden to develop testing. This is an explicit prohibition from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. January 10, tests were available in other countries. The FDA refused to allow them to be used in the US. They have no reciprocity condition, which is, in my opinion, completely crazy. If a drug or treatment is certified as safe in Japan, in Germany, in South Korea, and Norway, you'd think that's safe enough for people in Texas and New York. No, 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 no. We need an American solution. So they explicitly said, you may not do that, gave the monopoly to the Centers for Disease Control, which produced a small number of tests that didn't work. They were faulty. They were giving simply erroneous results because one of the reagents was incorrect. So we lost months of testing as a consequence of forbidding the private sector to respond. There's a very heroic doctor, I think she may have saved many lives, Dr. Helen Chu from Washington State in the United States. She was seeing people dying of a terrible disease. She reads the newspapers. She knew about this happening elsewhere. She said, I want to test. No, you may not, you may not. And finally she said, you know, I won't use a vulgar word. She said, the hell with you. And she got the test and she tested it. She proved that they had an outbreak and was able to, I think, save maybe thousands of lives just in that one community because she defied the state. So there are some lessons here. We should not be putting impediments in the way of private laboratories and private providers. In the United States, our regulatory system has suffocated private response. Respirators, the breathing masks you wear, there are 4 government agencies, 4 different ones that regulate them. And all of them say, no, 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 you have to fill out all the papers, all the forms. It would take weeks and weeks and weeks before you're allowed to do it. They have forbidden private companies to sterilize masks. In the state of Ohio, a private company said, we can sterilize them quite effectively for reuse. No, not allowed. Then they said, okay, but only 10,000 a day. They said, we can do 270,000. And the governor had to intervene to allow that to happen. This is a broken regulatory system. And the consequence of these kinds of command and control, a request for permission or insistence on permission is turning out to be deadly. So there are some lessons that we can learn from there, and libertarians are well positioned to offer them in a constructive manner. We need to be very careful in our rhetoric, not to sound like just the angry people on the side complaining all the time. We have constructive solutions, and these are proven to make life better and to save lives.
Thank you for your answer. I would follow up with a general question about the US American healthcare system, because typically when we are in Europe, it gets criticized for being this free market capitalist system. But whenever I talk to Americans, and it's not just libertarians or classical liberals, to me, it doesn't seem like a real free market system. It seems like the worst possible combination of a free market system and a regulated, very strongly regulated government system.
It's not
Why
just,
do you think?
yes, it's not just strongly regulated. It has additional pathological features that can be diagnosed if you know the history and a little bit of economics. It's a very much state-controlled system. Well over half of the financing for healthcare comes from the government, just directly. There's not private sector. And it comes with price controls and all kinds of very strange regulations that impede the delivery of medical care. In addition, the way that it is financed on the consumer side is extremely inefficient and generates very negative consequences because of government policy. Goes back to the Second World War, when the government, in order to win the war, imposed wage and price controls. This is actually not a good way to mobilize industry, because it meant that they could not attract workers into the war armaments factories, because you could not offer any more money. So the employer said, well, this is crazy. What will we do? And they said, we'll offer you a free health insurance policy. And that went before the government board for wage and price controls. Is it a wage increase? And they said, well, this is clearly, the wage controls are harmful. So they said, no, it's not. It does not violate the wage controls. Then, shortly after the war, the question came up before the Internal Revenue Service, the tax board, is it, if it's not a wage, is it taxable? And they said, no, it's not a wage, so you cannot tax it. Well, you see what happened over time. Everyone gets their health insurance from their employer. So I can give you $1,000 of wages and you pay tax on it, or I can give you a insurance policy worth $1,000 and it's not taxed. Almost everyone over time came to receive their insurance from their employer, which means it limits labor mobility and freedom to change jobs, because you lose your insurance policy when you move to another. It's a completely crazy, terrible system, in my opinion. In addition, it means that you are now reliable on a third-party payer, because when you go to the doctor, you say, well, I'm not paying, insurance is paying. So no one shops for prices. Imagine a market economy with no prices and no one knows what anything costs. You go to a restaurant or you go to buy a car and you say, I like it. They tell you how wonderful the car is or the food. And you say, well, let me think, how much does it cost? Oh, don't worry, we'll bill you later. Just don't worry. Your insurance will pay for it. So no one has an incentive to shop for good prices, to look around, and so on. This is a really big problem. In addition, the insurance markets are highly controlled. You cannot compete across state lines. So we have Pennsylvania and New Jersey right next to each other. You live here in New Jersey, you cannot buy from a Pennsylvania producer or a California or Nebraska. Only New Jersey insurance companies.
So interstate protectionism.
Unbelievable protectionism in every state. We can go on and on. And then finally, to give you a view of what a cartelized market this is, I don't want to paint it so badly. It's not the worst in the world. There's always Burkina Faso, for example, which is far worse. But they deliberately limit the number of hospitals and ventilators and so on, because you have to get a certificate of need if you want to open a clinic or even install a new ventilator. You must go and get a certificate of need. And who can deny it? All the other providers of that service in your community who don't like the competition. So we need to cut through these, get rid of certificates of need, get rid of obstacles to insurance competition, which is a very cartelized regulated market. Well, what's the consequence of this overall? Healthcare spending goes up and up and up. Not too surprising as a superior good. Healthcare is one of those things, as our incomes go up, unlike food, we tend to spend a higher percentage on healthcare. It's what's called a superior good in economics. But it's gone up at an astonishing rate. If you want to find the biggest increase, it was immediately after Medicare was imposed on the population. The 1 year following Medicare financing, government financing at the federal level for healthcare for 65 years and up, it went up 21.9% in 1 year. And for the next 5 years, an average of 13% per year, a price increase in medical care, because you now had the federal government as a third-party payer. So it has a lot of problems. It's not completely broken, but I think that we need to look at the perverse incentives that have been created by the government and return to proper, decent incentives for quality provision of medical care. It's definitely not a free market.
All right, thank you for this answer. So you said that we as libertarians have constructive ways in order to solve at least some of the issues resulting from this crisis. However, I feel that inside the libertarian movement, there is a lot of disagreement when it comes to the measures taken by governments, when it comes to the dangers that might come from these measures. And I myself find shifting between all those groups. I can understand that this is an extraordinary situation, that this is not a normal situation where we can just simply apply all parts of our ideas. On the other hand, I still see the dangers of too strong government policies, of lockdowns, of the surveillance state. What do you think is the right way to deal with this problem as libertarians in these discussions? Because I feel very uncertain. I don't know what to do, what to say if I wanted to present my position as a libertarian.
Well, I think that some uncertainty is appropriate and some humility in this case. My colleague at the Cato Institute, David Bowes, presented a flow chart. You know what a flow chart is? Yes, no, and then it has all the different decision trees. And it said a flow chart for the rest of us. Are you a COVID-19 expert? And then the arrow said no, and stops there. I'm not an expert on epidemiology. I'm not an expert on infectious diseases. I'm not an expert on how ventilators work, and so on. And I try to be careful in expressing opinions about such matters when they're outside of my normal range of knowledge. And I think that that kind of humility is appropriate. I did learn that almost everyone on Facebook is an epidemiologist, however, and has strong opinions about these matters. And I've been careful in trying to be more modest and focus on what I do know. Incentives are something I know something about. And also the dangers of accumulating powers after an emergency. So the first point I would make, I think it's important for libertarians to be the responsible parties in this discussion. And I'm very, very appreciative of Students for Liberty raising money for the Red Cross. I know Students for Liberty in Italy has been very active in this. I know Students for Liberty in other countries, as young people, have been active in helping elderly people in their communities with food deliveries, with making runs to go to the pharmacy for them. Understanding, of course, you don't go give them a hug afterwards, you leave it on their doorstep or in front of their door. And I've been very, very impressed to see that in a wide number of countries. I'm in touch with hundreds and hundreds of people involved in the libertarian movement and Students for Liberty around the planet. And their response has been really impressive. And we need to present that to the public. We are responsible people. I do think that in emergency situations or extraordinary conditions, extraordinary rules or principles can apply. But there's still rules and principles, and that's a very important part. So a quarantine in a time of an infectious disease is not nanny state regulation. It's not just protecting you from yourself, it's protecting your neighbors from being infected by you. And it's stopping people from being vectors for contagious diseases that are deadly to other people who may be more vulnerable. This is a very important point for all of us to remember. I get the flu vaccine every year, not just because I hate the flu, but I don't want to give it to other people as well. So I take the time to make sure that I'm vaccinated for those things. So there's an externality argument, if you will, that's a good ground for quarantine rules and restrictions on mass gatherings. As painful as those are, I think that we have to accept them. What matters, though, is to make sure that they are effective. So I'll give you an example of one that was not effective. The internal restriction on movement within the Schengen zone, I think, actually was counterproductive. The blockading of the German-Polish border, you had people for as many as 38 hours waiting in their cars, all cramped together to get home, to visit families. This actually made the situation worse. It would be one thing if on one side of a border you had infected people and on the other side, no infected people. I could understand an argument, but this was not the case in many of these internal Schengen restrictions. And I think those were just knee-jerk reaction. When the Trump administration, to look at a study in incompetence in response to a public health problem, they said, all the Americans have to come home. Quick, quick, quick. So people rushed to get on the last planes that they get on to come to the US. And what happened? Tens of thousands of people crammed together inside airports because they didn't bother to allow them to space out their time, and they didn't bother to bring on more people to process the passports. Well, they just created cauldrons of infection. This was really, really stupid, in my opinion, and just reactionary, blurting things out. So number one, these new policies have to be effective and not simply knee-jerk responses. Number two, they're temporary. They should be time limited explicitly, unlike in Hungary, which now has an effective dictatorship of one man, Viktor Orban, unlimited, with no time limit, no need to call parliament ever. As long as he considers it to be necessary, he continues to rule as the dictator of Hungary. These should be very clearly time limited. Parliament, if it can continue to meet, should do so. If it's via Zoom and Skype and whatever, that's fine. And judicial processes as well. We need to think about what happens after the emergency passes. I don't know when that will be. Again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but we have to be ready to demand that when we are returned to normal times, that normal rules apply. The rule of law is not some kind of frivolous extravagance or a luxury. It's vital to the maintenance of our civilizations. So we have to demand the rule of law and the presumption of liberty once this crisis has passed. One could say a lot more, but I hope that's a good start.
So thank you for this answer. Stephen Davies makes the point that pandemics historically have led to the shortening of supply chains and also to less movement between borders. And while I am not very concerned about the movements inside the countries, because I don't think that we can be closed in our apartments forever. I am very, very concerned about the outside of borders movement. What do you think will be the case? Do you think that there is a real danger of borders, for example, coming back inside the Schengen zone?
Yes, I think it is a very serious danger, and I think it is one that should be resisted. And again, to do so in a reasonable manner that shows an understanding of these extraordinary circumstances, but says we are not going to be penned inside of our countries again. One of our Polish friends posted something, Marek Tatawa, who's very active in Students for Liberty, on the Polish-Czech border where there's the river between them, and people put up signs saying, I miss you, Pole, I miss you, Czech. We need to return to that kind of community and allow people to travel when this is over. I think that there'll be some changes. I suspect face masks are going to become a part of the fashion afterwards, but I don't think that we should be restricting people's freedom to travel under normal circumstances. Now, there could be quarantine conditions that I don't anticipate that we should be aware of and willing to accommodate them. But what we are seeing right now is a psychological reaction, not rooted in sound policies or good public health, and that is fear of the other people. We want to find an enemy, and it's very difficult to see a virus as an enemy, but it's very easy to see French people or German people or Jews or Roma people or whomever as the enemy. That's one of the reasons why I'm so disgusted by the American administration insisting on referring to this as the Chinese virus. It's deeply hateful. It's, in my opinion, simply disgusting. Yes, it first appeared in China, but that's not why they're saying that. They want to demonize someone, Chinese people. And the consequence have been, in Great Britain, people of Asian descent beaten savagely on the streets by what they call yobs in England. And we've seen some examples in the US of people insulting Asian Americans, following them and taunting them. This is unacceptable, and we need to stop that now, just now. We know where that road leads, and we do not want to go down that road. The nationalism, I think, is an understandable psychological reaction. All forms of collectivism are, but we need to resist them and understand this is a public health crisis posed by a virus and the vectors of transmission. The other element to remember is that politicians who have power like power. They like to keep it. Once you have it, it's the best thing in the world. James Madison in 1794 wrote a letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson, and he warned Jefferson of what he called, quote, the old trick of turning every contingency into a resource for accumulating force in the government. This has been recognized for a very, very long time, that emergencies are always an excuse to get more and more and more and more powers, wealth, expenditure, and so on in the hands of the government. And we need to be very alert at the same time that we are the responsible people who recognize that some curtailments of normal freedoms of association for limited times are appropriate.
My next question would be, what will be the political result of the crisis? So there are dangers for multiple administrations. Typically, the way crisis situations like these go, in the beginning, the public stands behind the government. People stand behind, let's call them leaders. But later, it might shift very strongly, especially if an economic crisis, which isn't unlikely, might come, right? So there is a case for destabilization of the state, of governments. There is also a case for quick shifts in the opinions of people. So shifts in parliaments and governments. How do you think will this crisis affect governments, for example, in the US? Or yeah, there will also be an election in Poland, although we aren't sure if it actually will take place.
I don't think that there's any clear answer in this regard. There are enormous dangers ahead. There is a pandemic of authoritarianism coming, and even dictatorship. And we need to be ready for it. This is not a time for defeatism. This is a time to say we have to prepare ourselves. So we can see in some contexts the tremendous danger of dictatorship. The Hungarian example is very clear. The Chinese government is promoting this story all around the world, which is false, that it was the Communist Party of China that saved China, etc. We need to rebut that effectively without being anti-Chinese, but against the Communist Party's monopoly on knowledge and on political power. And we need to be able to explain what will be given up. The authoritarians everywhere want more power, and they are opportunistic in seeing this as their occasion to cement power and to eliminate libertarianism. All of them, and I'm not just being egocentric, they see us as the enemy. The left wing and the right wing, the nationalists and the socialists are all, they're getting out their guns and going after liberalism. That's the cause of every problem in the world. And if only they had power, we wouldn't have these problems. Now they're fighting as to who should have the power, but that's their answer, just power. We need to be ready to insist on constitutional procedures, on the basic law in Germany, on the Constitution of the United States and other similar documents. We need to stand as patriots also. This is very important. Not nationalists, not ugly collectivists who blame foreigners, but as patriots who believe in the future of our countries. And we want to have a society of civility and not fear, because that is what we will live under forever if we lose this fight. I'll be very frank and honest. I worry, I had a nightmare that in 100 years, some underground dissidents will be talking about what information they can find about the lost golden age of liberty from 1989 to 2020. And I don't want that to happen. I want to preserve our liberty. I want to extend it. And that means every one of the participants in this conversation and all of your friends need to be resolute on behalf of our principles. Now, we recognize that principles apply in certain contexts, and we're in a different emergency circumstance for a limited period of time. But that is no reason to abandon principles that have stood the test of time, that have increased human well-being and flourishing, and that have made us far more capable of responding to this pandemic than we would have been otherwise. So now is the time to do it. Now, someone might say, well, if you're not sure that you can repeal all of these things after, why should you advocate for them? Well, the first reason is because it's right. The second reason is because it's about our future. It's about your future. And for all the young people listening, I'm deeply sorry and sad that this is happening on your watch, but it will fall to you to insist on time-honored principles of the rule of law, of personal responsibility and freedom, of free markets and free exchange. That is the task that falls on your shoulders. I will do my part. I'm not going to give up. But my personal prediction is the vast majority of you will live a lot more time from now than I will. And this is a task that falls to your generation.
Counterintuitively, these measures might actually be something good for libertarianism as an ideology, as an idea.
We will see, because there's a kind of a psychological difficulty that we need to deal with. Libertarians think about unintended consequences. They think about the indirect nature of human causation. You can't just will things into existence. There's no magic. Hogwarts and the Harry Potter world is a fantasy. We don't actually live there. I can't just bring into being by government edict, by saying something, if I'm Viktor Orban or Donald Trump or whomever, that there'll be health and safety. The world doesn't work that way. We have rules and principles that create incentives, and incentives change behavior. And we understand that. But it requires a degree of abstract thinking that's costly. And costly things, the higher the cost, the less people engage in them. So it's a little bit difficult for us when other people engage in fear mongering. They can say, oh my God, we need total absolute power. The reaction is psychological. When there's a threat, small children run behind daddy's legs and look out from behind the legs, protect me. And they see government or the ruler, Orban, Putin, Xi Jinping, whoever it is, as daddy who's going to protect us. And daddy has amazing powers that you and I don't have. We don't think that way. We understand that there's behavior that are influenced by incentives. We want to get the incentives right. To get the incentives right, you need to get the rules right. And so making our case is a little bit more difficult, but make it we must. We have to do that. At the same time, we have to respond emotionally to people who are afraid and recognize people are afraid. They're afraid of other people giving them germs. They're afraid of dying. And we need to acknowledge and recognize that, and yet be the voice of reason and think about the long term and the likely consequences of changes in behavior. I do think that the negative externality involved is adequate to justify not total lockdowns, but quarantine measures and restrictions on people congregating, whether it's churches or mosques or synagogues or temples or rock concerts or whatever it might happen to be. These are vectors in which people come together, many get infected, and then they go apart. The externality argument, in my opinion, is simply overwhelming to restrict that. But total shutdowns of economy and society may be too much. I'll give you an example. In New York, they said only essential businesses may be open, and they gave a list of them. Non-essential have to be closed. Well, there was a fashion designer who makes really unbelievably expensive wedding dresses for high society ladies. And he said, we know how to sew things. We're very good at it. He contacted all their workers. They had sewing machines at home. They're making high quality medical protection gear and gowns and so on, for which are in short supply. But they could only produce about 50 a day amongst all of them, not very much. He said, if we can go to the workshop, have social distancing, all be masked, not touch each other, we can produce thousands. He had to ask the governor of New York personally for permission. That doesn't make any sense to me. There should instead be a principle that says, if you maintain during this quarantine time, the social distancing and the good sanitary practices, you can do it, rather than deciding, we will tell you what is essential and everything else is non-essential. For one thing, you realize, we have now discovered, that non-essential businesses often produce parts of things that are produced by essential businesses. And this, I think, has been a mistaken approach to close everything, to say only essential, which is groceries and pharmacies, and everything else is closed. I think this is an overreach of power, and it's had negative consequences.
All right, thank you. So I think that at this point we can jump to the questions from the audience. And I would like to start with a question. How can we begin to grow the libertarian movement after the CV-19 crisis is over? In my experience, we have always been shunned as a fringe movement. How can we start to build it? What are some alternative methods, or some methods we haven't used until now?
I think among them has been what Students for Liberty has been doing in Europe and in America, to make sure people know that as young people, you are taking actions to help your communities and doing so in a voluntary way. If you're the people who, what I did in my neighborhood, I'm just one person in my neighborhood. I used my printer right here in my little home office, and I printed up leaflets that said, and I posted them all over the neighborhood, if you are above a certain age or have a weakened immune system, don't go out for groceries and medicines. Call on your neighbors. Here's my phone number, here's my email, and I'm happy to help you. And I've helped some people in my neighborhood who are quite aged and they can't really get out. And we talk from great distance, and they tell me what they need, and I go and get it for them. I think it's good to be seen as doing that, and then document it. Show that you are the people who are standing up. We don't have to rely only on the police or the state to do these things. We as members of civil society can and should be active as well. Now, obviously use all the proper safety measures. Don't touch the people, and wash your hands, and you wear even just normal winter gloves. You don't have to have medical gloves to protect yourself and them. That's one thing. Second thing is to remind people of the tremendous values of accountability of power, that unaccountable power is unacceptable. it will behave badly. We know this. And to resist measures to postpone elections or cancel elections or to suspend judicial procedures, there's no reason for that. We can have legislative processes continue by means of remote hookups and so on. And it's been customary for many years for judicial processes to proceed via teleconferencing. So those who have been calling for shutting down the judiciaries and the legislatures and putting all the hands in the power of the executive need to be resisted very strongly. And we should focus on an unaccountable government is a government that will act badly. And we need accountability. We need also to demand freedom of speech and to resist measures that attempt to censor people or shut down newspapers or broadcasters on the grounds that it's fake news and so on. There is such a thing as fake news, deliberate propagation of misinformation. The Kremlin has been doing this for some years. They have thousands of employees sending out false information, including in this crisis. They've been sending out false information about vaccination, about healthcare, about all sorts of, and they will continue. Let's resist that. But don't allow that to be the excuse for shutting down the media. And I fear that that is a very real possibility. It's already happened in Hungary. It certainly happened in China. It's happened already in Russia. It's happened in Turkey. And it's a virus, a pandemic that I think will continue. We need to resist that too.
Thank you for your answer. We have a question from YouTube. Should we be preppers? What's your thoughts on learning autarky, self-sufficiency for times of survival?
Well, I'm a modest, temperate prepper in that way. I don't think that this is the end of the world. I don't anticipate outbreaks of cannibalism and so on and so on and so on. But I do have food. I do have emergency water. I always have in my car, I always have an emergency kit. If I get stuck in the snow someplace, I don't want to freeze to death. I have a blanket. I have flashlights, including wind-up flashlights. I have emergency food and water in my car. I don't think that makes me an extremist or a kook, but I just think it makes me careful. And similarly in my house. So I do think that people should be ready for at least 2 weeks of not being able to get food and safe water. There are lots of ways to prepare for that, like the life straw, which allows you to draw water from sources you wouldn't normally want to drink from, ponds and streams and rivers and puddles of water and so on. So I do believe in having those. It's not a matter of political philosophy. In my opinion, it's just a matter of being prepared in the world. I was raised as a boy, my parents, who had been through very terrible, horrible experiences, told me that there are two types of people in the world. There are people who are prepared and there are victims. And they wanted me to be one of the prepared people. So I'm a modest, moderate prepper in that regard. And I do think that's just a matter of personal responsibility.
Thank you for your answer. So the next question would be, can resistance in circumstances like Hungary always stay non-violent, or is Orban's action already enough to justify civil unrest?
Well, I'm not in favor of violence generally. I'm generally opposed to it. Good things do not come from this. They generally do not end well at all. The few examples of violent resistance to authoritarianism, people remember the successful ones, but they don't remember the many, many, many more that made it much worse. So I don't advise that. I think it's a very bad idea. And anyone who tried that would be crushed instantly, and they would be crushed with the support of the bulk of the population as well, who fear an external enemy, virus, foreigners, whatever it happens to be, and consequently it would generate more support for a dictatorship. So I think this is exactly the wrong response. And I just want to be unequivocal so no one could quote me out of context. That's a really bad idea.
There is a question you have already answered in the chat, but I actually would like you to address that a little further. So one of our viewers is writing that in his lifetime, he has never seen an emergency measure that ended up being repealed. Not after 9/11, not after terrorist attacks since 2015. How can you be confident that the measures that are taken now will be repealed?
I'm not confident. That's why we have our work cut out for us. There's a difference between being not confident and being defeatist. Those are not the same. I'm not defeatist. I don't say, ah, we're going to lose, give up, it's all over, go live in a hole, get some oatmeal and some gold coins and a shotgun and live in a little cave someplace. That's not my view at all. I'm not in the least bit defeatist. I'm more determined to fight for these. If I were confident that they would be repealed, then I'd say, well, I won't bother. They're going to be repealed. I'm confident. So why should I spend my time on it? I could be doing something else I like more. It's exactly because I'm not confident that I want to work all the harder. The value of these principles is so high. These are so precious to all of us. We should fight for them. And we should fight for them because we are not confident that they will be restored. Now is an extraordinarily important time to do that. Now, that said, there are also some differences between the 9/11 and 2015 attacks and now. And those differences are that we can more clearly talk about the failures of medical systems that are state dominated, not with the confirmation bias that Adam, you mentioned earlier. Oh my God, if only there was laissez-faire capitalism, there would be no viruses. That's of course absurd. But to look at concrete cases of what worked and what didn't work. We do need public health responses as a core responsibility of government, the same as being, I shouldn't say the same, but analogously to being invaded by a foreign invader. There is an analogy there, although they're not the same. But then to ask, how do we mobilize the voluntary sector to produce respirators, to produce hospital beds, to produce personal protective equipment for medical personnel and masks and so on and so on and so on. And I've been focusing on those questions. The US is an example of a government that failed. They failed because of grotesque incompetence and because we have a nationalistic president who actively stopped public health measures and a bureaucracy that stifled the private sector, as I mentioned earlier. There are lessons to be learned, and we are trying to inform the public in the United States of the failures of the public system and the failures of the regulatory system. The Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. has produced a hashtag never needed. All of these restrictions on provision of medical equipment that now we're saying, oh, they need to lift them, they're never needed. The certificates of need that restrict the provision of medical care, clinics, hospitals, beds, ventilators, etc., they were never needed. And we want to see these removed, struck from the books. They're pure cartel legislation. They have no public benefit whatsoever. And we want to push very hard to draw the lessons. And those are lessons that could lead to much more liberty-friendly reforms.
Another question is, first of all, this user is also saying, thank you for your time. I have really learned and appreciated. And he asks, how do you see a way back for countries that have moved to authoritarianism, from Turkey and Hungary to China, on the left and right? And where do you see and fear falling into So which countries do you fear will fall into this category in the future, right now?
I think that there are ways back, and one of the reasons is that authoritarian or dictatorial regimes, in some sense, own whatever happens afterward. And if they completely fail, they can be held accountable. But that's all the more reason why libertarians have to be part of that process, because there's always someone more dictatorial who say, if only I had been in charge, I would have been stronger. So that the process of an authoritarian government feeling, it can tip towards liberalism, but it can also tip towards even worse dictatorship. And that's the reason why real liberals, libertarians, if you will, need to be there when states fail to say this is the better solution. We need to have accountable government and rule of law. And then to focus it in those terms, it's about accountability. It's about maintaining accountable government and not addressing this as if it's a logic exercise. And let me mention one last point in this regard. I don't think that it's helpful to regard libertarianism as just an exercise in logic. You start with some robust major premise, non-aggression axiom or something like that, and then everything is just deduced. That's just a logical exercise, and then you figure out the whole world and you know everything. I think that's very immature and not serious. We need to learn from experience. We need to learn from history, sociology, psychology, and other disciplines, and be the ones who can make the case in terms that communicate with people. And that is to talk about government accountability, about how we solve the problems together, rather than saying, I deduced the correct answer from some logical exercise. It's silly and immature, and it surely does not convince anyone.
We are already over the time. However, we have still questions coming in. So I think we can do for another 5 to 10 minutes, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Just right now, another question. So one of our viewers is asking, does it fall on libertarians to keep an eye on the economy through this crisis? And when does it become applicable to consider the economic effects over the potential health effects of the virus?
I think it's a deep and important question. It needs to be addressed in a sober manner. At some point, if the economy stops producing wealth, there won't be food, there won't be consumer goods. Someone has to be producing the stuff that is even consumed by medical workers and hospitals. So the idea of just shutting down the economy entirely is self-defeating. You'll get less of everything, including less health, and you'll get more deaths. So I do think we need to talk about that. We need to talk about trade-offs in an intelligent way that doesn't lead people to say, oh, you value money over life and so on. But to talk about what are those trade-offs in terms most people can understand. If you shut down all the private companies, who's going to make the ultraviolet devices for disinfecting and the medicines and the isopropyl alcohol and on and on and on? I think what we should do, instead of saying essential and non-essential, is to allow people to produce goods in, whether it's stores, factories, whatever, under the safe conditions that they don't become just vectors of infection. So much more limited kind of control mechanisms, and less requiring to call the governor of New York to get permission to open your factory for sewing medical equipment, which is madness, in my opinion. I do think that although some people have criticized it for the overtones, that allowing people to show that they have immunity, you were sick and you have antibodies now, is perfectly reasonable and normal procedure. In some society with less statism, insurance companies would be handling these things. Okay, but we don't live in that society. right now. But I think that there are changes that would improve our abilities to produce wealth. You cannot indefinitely bottle people up in their houses or apartments forever. For many reasons, we're all acquainted with them. You stop producing, the consequences in loss of prosperity will be very, very severe. That will lead to further knock-on consequences. There'll be social unrest. I'm very worried about people in the hourly wage economy, waiters and barbers, haircutters, so many people, they have no income right now. And if they didn't accumulate a lot of savings, what are they going to do? This cannot continue indefinitely. So we need to think about measures that would allow the economy to recover, that would allow economic activity to continue without shutting it down. And last point, stimulus is not what we need. The approach of so many people saying we need stimulus, it's madness. We don't want people going and buying more things in stores. This is not somehow a lack of aggregate demand. It's a collapse in supply. This is not like a normal recession or depression. It's a total collapse in supply. And we need to allow people to restart supply, growing food and manufactured products and all the other things to have a normal society and do so in a smart and careful way.
Thank you for your answer. So there is an interesting question about the reaction of the USA and the European countries. How do you think they failed to predict the spread of the virus? Because we had some information in January. We have a lot of government agencies, and this is actually one of the main tasks of those to prevent things like this to happen. Why do you think that the US and also the European Union as a collective, if you will, has failed to answer quickly as, for example, South Korea, Singapore, and other countries, Taiwan?
I think this is a very clear government failure. Can expect to be blaming neoliberalism or something like that for it. I think that's just foolishness. South Korea has a market economy and accountable rule of law and so on as well. But they learned from previous healthcare crises how dangerous this was. And they had a system that allowed private enterprise to go immediately into production of personal protective equipment, PPE, and testing. And testing, it turns out, from the experience we have so far, seems to be an essential part of the process. The US has been an exceptionally poor performer in this regard, partly because we have a president who just opens his mouth and whatever random electrical activity was in his brain comes out of his mouth. So he said, it's nothing, don't worry. There's timelines of this that are just shocking, telling people, go out, go to restaurants, shake hands with people. I'm shaking everyone's hands. This was grotesque and irresponsible, in my opinion. And then saying it's 15 people, it's under control, soon it'll be 0. Well, that didn't happen. And then utter lies, utter lies. Don't worry, Google has 600 employees, engineers work on it. That wasn't true. It was a surprise to Google. Walmart will have testing at all their parking lots. That wasn't true. They just made these things up. And yet, he stands in front of the public every day and people listen to what Daddy has to say. We need to remind them that what he said was rubbish and nonsense and lies, simple lies. There were people in various government agencies and intelligence who were warning our political leaders, and they didn't listen. They didn't listen. And the consequence is now going to be additional thousands of deaths because people were not prepared and not ready for this. So I think they should be held accountable for a failure of doing one of their core jobs to protect public health. Public health is not the same as health. It's a subcategory. Having a broken bone or an earache or eye problems or visual problems, those are health problems, but they're not public. I can't catch your broken bone from you or your other problems. But a virus, I sure can. That's a public health problem. And there is a legitimate role of government to protect us from that. And in a number of countries, they failed. I was in Singapore and Indonesia until March 12th. I flew back to the US. Every place, not only at the airports, but private hotels, you were checked with a temperature check. You had to give information what seat on the plane you were on, where you're going to be, how they can reach you, where you're going to be going, your phone number, your email, and so on. I came to the United States from Jakarta, landed, and they said, have you been in? No one has masks, gloves, nothing among all the government employees. Have you been in China or Iran in the last 14 days? No, I haven't. Okay, that's it. I said, seriously? Really? This is the response to what now everyone on March 12th understood was a serious infectious disease? And now we continue to see government agencies walking around, no protection, in close proximity to each other. It's madness. And I hope everyone who's listening, as we begin to wind down, will take the actions to protect yourselves. But remember, when you do so, you're young and healthy, so the chance of dying is pretty small. But by the way, not zero. There are people in their teens and 20s who have already died from this, who were very healthy beforehand. It's just much lower. But you have family members and neighbors and teachers whom you respect. And when you take action to protect yourselves, and we all know what they are now, you are also protecting all those around you. Because we should love not only our own personal freedom, but take care of the interests and the rights of other people as well. In a sense, libertarians are more focused on that solidarity than the collectivists. We're the ones who believe in responsibility and believe in not harming other people.
So I already apologized in advance to all the people who couldn't listen to their question answer, but we have a lot of questions and we have to let you go someday. So this will be the last question. What kind of threats do you see for democracy? And I think we have covered the threats of governments and government measures, but I think in this regard, it's meant that elections have to be postponed because of the crisis. And maybe do you have any solutions for, I mean, it's a hard time. What would you do?
What would I do about what? Can you specify a little bit more clearly for me?
I think a good example here is, for example, the Polish presidential election on the 10th of May, where people will vote for a very important institution and very important position in the Polish government, the Polish state. There is a significant risk of infections when people go into the voting booth, etc. However, you can't postpone elections until the end of time, right? There are terms, there are positions to hold. What would you do? What can we even do?
I think this is a very important time for political leaders and governments and civil servants and so on to do their job of making it possible to vote, to do so electronically, to do so through mail-in ballots, and to make those available. So in the state of Wisconsin, for example, this has been a big discussion there about the primaries and about the filling of local offices. And they are proceeding, but they are moving very far towards ballots by mail, by post, and other forms. And I think that that's a reasonable response. It's not perfect, but the fact is, if your poll workers are put at risk, and by the way, poll workers in many countries tend to be disproportionately from the older generation. So they're more vulnerable. They're putting themselves at risk if 500 people come in front of them. But to set these things up that if it has to be in-person voting, there are ventilated spaces, that there's air flowing through them. This seems to be an important part of the health conditions. Or that they can be done by post, by mailing in your ballot. You receive one that's for you only and you send it in. So I think that this is not a time to just give up, throw up our hands and say, well, nothing can be done. The president said we had to postpone the election, but to demand, come up with ways to continue accountable, democratically accountable government under these difficult circumstances. That's their job. And my view when talking to politicians is to say, you know, you have a limited number of authentic responsibilities. Do your job. Don't go around subsidizing this and taking money from this person to give to that person and making insane, crazy speeches and giving people false advice about medical care and all the other things that we hear regularly. Do your job. And one of them is to assure the continuity of legal and political institutions, that the city council and the mayors and so on are going to be elected and able to fulfill their responsibilities. So I don't think this is an occasion to just give up on these questions. And lastly, I'll mention one final point. Democracy, if by that people mean unlimited majority rule, is unlibertarian and illiberal. We don't want to have majorities saying this minority or that minority must be punished for religion or skin color or whatever it happens to be. But democratic process is referred to liberalism, the rule of law, a constitutionally limited government, very clear limited powers to government, and then a democratic process to hold them accountable. And we need to maintain that as a strong ideal and not say, oh, who needed democracy anyway? Because the alternative to democracy isn't liberty, it's dictatorship. And that we do not want. So hold them accountable, do your job, and I do not think we should allow this postponement and eventually nullification of elections. I fear that in the United States as well, by the way, not only in other countries, but I believe that the President of the United States, if he could, would cancel the election. And we have to insist that is not going to happen.
Thank you for this last answer. Also, thank you for being here with us tonight or today. I don't know where people could be listening. We did our marketing worldwide, so doesn't matter where you're listening to. Thank you also for being here. If you have just tuned in, don't worry. There is a YouTube video of this stream on YouTube, so you can access this discussion on YouTube and you can watch it again. You can't, of course, ask questions, but it's still a pretty interesting video, I think. I also want to repeat my pleas to spend some money on the Spanish SFL action for the fundraiser with the Spanish Cross, Red Cross. You have the link here in the chat. I have posted it, and the link is also in the description. And I also want to invite you to the next webinar. The next webinar will also take place on Sunday, the same time, the same place. We will have a Zoom seminar and a YouTube video. And we will talk to another senior fellow of the Cato Institute. We will talk to Johan Norberg, so another great speaker. We are your weekly portion of liberty. It's good stuff. We're giving it away pretty much for free. So I hope to see you next week.